Welcome to our podcast today. We appreciate you joining us. Those of you that have been following us over the last month or so, our first podcast dealt a little bit with the ancestry of the prophet Joseph Smith, those that hailed from Topsfield, 5 generations of Smiths. Our second podcast dealt with all of the influential people that came out of Vermont and New Hampshire that ultimately would play a real significant role in establishing the church. Today we're going to get into a little bit more on Joseph, the things that transpired during his early life. And I felt the best way to do that was perhaps to take you on a tour of the Joseph Smith Memorial Visitor Center. My wife and I were blessed to have had the opportunity in 2018 and 19 to have served here as historians at this site. The monument that you see in the middle was completed in December of 1905 under the direction of Junius Wells. And our next podcast will focus entirely on how that monument came to be. The Visitor Center was completed in 1961. Now, prior to the Visitor Center was a memorial cottage that was built nearby. It was located very close to where that monument stands today, and it was over the home site of the Smith cabin where the prophet Joseph Smith was born. As we enter our visitor center, you're going to see one of the most recognizable portraits of the prophet Joseph Smith. In 1959, the church commissioned the well-known portrait artist Alvin Gittins to complete this portrait, this piece. Beautiful piece, used quite often in our temples and in presentations involving the prophet Joseph Smith. During Joseph's lifetime, newspapers often were very critical and maligned the prophet on a variety of points. However, occasionally, some newspapers, such as the New York Herald, recognized the prophet. In this particular case, Joseph Smith is undoubtedly one of the great characters of the age. He indicates as much talent, originality, and moral courage as Muhammad, or any other great spirit that have hitherto produced revolutions of past ages. Joseph Smith is creating a spiritual system combined also with moral and industry that may change the destiny of the race. And we have this one here. Written by Charles Mackay from the London Morning Chronicle in 1851. It cannot be denied that Joseph Smith was one of the most extraordinary persons of his time. Now, although Mr. Mackay never met the prophet in person, he did extensive research on him. One of the opportunities that he had to do some of this research happened in Liverpool, England. He heard that an immigrant ship was planning to transport Latter-day Saints to the United States, and he was able to speak to many of these converts about the prophet Joseph as well as their leaders, who eventually placed in his hands a whole barrel of information that was available to him to write his articles. Now, continuing into the Visitor Center, you come across this beautiful bronze by Alvard Fairbanks. Joseph Smith the prophet addressing the faithful. This sculpture the sculptor, Alvin Fairbanks, used the original death mask of the prophet as a guide to depict Joseph in his latter years. In the prophet's left hand, he placed 2 works that were brought forth by the prophet, the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price. In his other hand, he has a number of writings and revelations that had not yet been compiled or published. Mr. Fairbanks stated that he wanted to represent Joseph not only as a man who had passed through many trying experiences, but as the one who God had chosen for the gospel to be restored through. In this particular visitor center is the Howland family chart. It's found quite often in many visitor centers. It is used to emphasize the church interest in family history. It is also used to teach about Joseph Smith's ancestry. Joseph, as well as his wife Emma, were descendants of the Mayflower passenger John Howland. Howland was an indentured servant to a man named John Carver, a prominent Mayflower passenger. There were many significant storms during their journey to America. One nearly took the life of John Howland. During that storm, he was thrown overboard. William Bradford, the first governor of the Plymouth colony, recorded, and I quote, "John was thrown overboard, but miraculously saved. It pleased God that John caught hold of the ropes used to raise and lower the upper and lower sails, which had hung overboard. He held on until he was eventually hauled up." This is very providential for the church as well as the United States. For if John Howland had died at sea, we would not have had the prophet Joseph Smith nor his wife Emma Hale. We also would not have had President Franklin D. Roosevelt nor either of the Bush presidents. Next, we find some portraits of Joseph's father, Joseph Sr., by William Whitaker, commissioned in 1990. Joseph Sr. was born on July 12, 1771 in Topsfield, Massachusetts. Now, for those of you, again, who watched the first podcast, you'll remember our Topsfield Smiths. The Smith family attended the Congregational Church there in Topsfield and were active in civic affairs. In 1873, President George A. Smith erected this monument in the Topsfield Cemetery, Pine Grove Cemetery, as a tribute to the Smiths of Topsfield, and he said at the time, and I quote, "I have traveled to Egypt and the Holy Land. I have seen the countries of Europe and met many of their most distinguished people, but I have encountered nothing that gives me more satisfaction than being here in the graveyard of my ancestors on the grounds where they walked and lived 300 years ago." Now, Aziel Smith, this would be Joseph Smith Jr.'s grandfather, would leave Topsfield in 1791 seeking fortunes elsewhere, and he would purchase 83 acres of property in the Tunbridge Gore. Gore is property that is poorly surveyed that the government would like to sell cheap and have people homestead on. Now, the next picture is Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack, by Lee Green Richards, commissioned in 1905. Okay. Lucy was born on July the 8th, 1775, in Gilsum, New Hampshire. Now, Gilsum is considered Mack country. Solomon, Lucy's father, and other Mack relatives are buried at Gilsum in the Centennial Bond Cemetery. In 1795, Solomon Mack moved his family 63 miles north to Tunbridge, Vermont, where his son had established numerous successful businesses. They were some of the first settlers to be in Tunbridge. It was at one of these businesses, a general store, that the Smiths met the Macks. Lucy and Joseph Sr. were married January 24, 1796. Joseph and Lucy started their life together in Tunbridge, living on land given them by Aziel Smith as a wedding present. So they had property right next to Aziel Smith. In 1802, the family moved 18 miles west to the town of Randolph so Joseph Sr. could try his hand at operating a general store, much like what Lucy was clerking at. Unfortunately, this would be the financial downfall of the Smith family. It seems that Joseph Sr. was collecting ginseng root in the nearby forest in Vermont. Now, ginseng was used in everything from medicine to perfume. Joseph intended to sell his cash crop in China. A merchant named Stevens, who lived nearby in Randolph, offered him $3,000 for the root that he had collected. Joseph declined the offer, knowing that he could get $4,500 for his shipment in China. Joseph contracted, however, with Mr. Stevens' son to accompany the cargo to China. On his return, he reported that the venture had failed and all was lost. Joseph now found himself in debt, $3,800, to creditors in Boston, from whom he had purchased goods for his store in Randolph. At this time, it seems that young Stevens was opening his own ginseng operation nearby, and he was hiring 8 to 10 men. Well, Stephen Mack, Lucy's brother, suspected foul play, and in a fashion only known to him, I suppose, he was able to extradite the information from the young Stevens that apparently the ginseng root had sold for well over $4,500. Well, by the time the authorities were contacted, the Stevens had taken the money and fled to Canada. Well, after being defrauded, the Smiths moved back to the old farm there in Tunbridge from 1802 to 1804. They were then forced to sell their farm for half of its value. And Lucy had to give up her $1,000 wedding dowry that was given to her by her brother, and this was to pay the debt. Joseph would never own property again. They then moved, courtesy of Lucy's father, Solomon Mack, to a cabin owned by Solomon. On this picture, this is a diorama under glass. Joseph's birthplace has the black circle around it, and down the hill and slightly to the left is Solomon Mack's home. When Solomon purchased this property, there were two homes on it, the home he would live in and a vacant cabin on top of the hill. And this is in Sharon Township, right there on the border of Sharon Township and Royalton. And it would be in that cabin up there that Dad, Joseph Sr.'s father-in-law, would allow Joseph and his family to live, probably, if not rent-free, at a very, very discounted amount. And so they would stay there from 1804 to 1807. Joseph was born in that little cabin, Joseph Jr., on December 23rd, 1805. The cabin rented from Solomon was 22 by 20 feet. It was a clapboard-sided home with a centrally fluted chimney, and it had a half cellar down below. The site was actually determined by two stones that were found. The front doorstep, which faced southeast, and the hearthstone that's now been moved into the visitor's center. It was in front of this hearthstone that baby Joseph Jr. would have been born. The Smith family moved 9 different times in the 20 years of married life in the New England area. Some of them I have circled here. You're familiar with some of those, I'm sure. In 1811, the Smith would make their biggest move, some 24 miles away. They packed up their family and moved across the Connecticut River into New Hampshire to the town of West Lebanon. The home they would live in is this home that you see on the slide here. It was visible until 1967 when it was razed and burned down. It was while in this home, in the years of 1812 and 1813, a plague of typhoid fever, which is bad water or bad food, devastated the New Hampshire countryside. 6,400 people died in 5 months. All of the Smith children were infected in some degree. Sophronia, who was Joseph's older sister, was deathly ill. The doctors had administered to her for 90 days with no sign of improvement and basically have given up on her. Lucy, seeing the plight of her 9-year-old daughter with death so near at hand, knelt in prayer and supplication to the Lord. Miraculously, she did recover. She recovered completely. However, the plague was not selective, and 7-year-old Joseph Jr. was infected. His pain was initially looked at by Dr. Parker, who thought that the issue was a sprain of his left arm. It was anointed with liniment and left misdiagnosed. It was reevaluated 2 weeks later by Dr. Parker, who now found a very large fever sore underneath of his left arm. It was lanced, and a quart of fluid was drained. With Joseph suffering from typhoid fever and having had an undrained abscess, bacteria now spread by way of the bloodstream into the tibia of his left leg. As soon as the abscess was drained, the pain shot like lightning through the marrow of his left leg, and the leg started to swell. And for 3 weeks, it was swollen. Now, at this time, surgeons were brought in, and they put an 8-inch incision between Joseph's knee and ankle in an effort to relieve the swelling and some of the pain. This helped somewhat, but it did not stop the spread of the infection. The leg was allowed to heal for 2 to 3 weeks, and as it healed, the pain and swelling again returned. Hiram would spend hours sitting by the bed of Joseph, applying pressure to the leg to relieve the pain. Again, surgeons were called and the same procedure was performed. Again, the pain and swelling returned. The infection in the bone was left unchecked for at least 2 months. Now, these surgeons who made these initial incisions were now very discouraged, and they recommended to the family that the only way the boy could be saved is by amputating his leg. However, Lucy in particular sought a second opinion, and a council of surgeons were brought in. There were 11 individuals that were a part of this company, including Nathan Smith, founder of Dartmouth Medical School, his partner Cyrus Perkins and Dr. Stone, and then a group of medical students from the medical school. Dr. Smith asked permission to perform an experimental operation that might possibly save the boy's leg. Consent was given. Cords were brought in to tie the boy down in bed. Joseph refused to be bound. He was offered brandy and wine, and he refused both. All he wanted to do was sit in the arms of his father. They drilled on each side of the infected area and with forceps snapped out 3 large pieces of infected bone. Now, the pain involved in such an operation is the removal of the infected bone. If the dead bone is not completely removed from the living tissue, a sharp pain would shoot through the body. Joseph screamed loudly with the removal of the first piece of bone. With the removal of the 3rd fragment, Lucy came running into the room where she saw, and I quote, Joseph sitting in a pool of blood. After fainting, she was removed from the room. Well, the operation was finally over. As the wound healed, 14 small pieces of dead bone fragments, much like a sliver in your finger, would work their way out of Joseph's leg, and he would forever have a slight limp. This surgery was revolutionary and one of the first successful operations for osteomyelitis, thereby preventing amputation of the leg. After the operation, Joseph went to live with his uncle Jesse, who lived in Salem, Massachusetts, near the seashore, to heal for a season. From here, the family moved from West Lebanon, down in that lowlands that was so infected with all of this. They moved to the highlands of Norwich, Vermont. Now, this home that you see here, at least the portion that I have circled here, is about 2.5 miles up the Turnpike Road from the Norwich Village Common. Although the home has been renovated and remodeled over the years, the front portion of this looks much like it did in 1813 when the family moved there. The land west of the home was farmed by Joseph Sr. Joseph rented this home from Squire Murdock and attempted to work approximately 140 acres on the side of the hill there. It had to be very, very challenging. Well, the Smith family had 2 successive seasons of crop failure. As such, Lucy learned to paint and peddle oilcloths, which were popular floor coverings at this particular time, and Joseph Sr. sold fruit from his orchard. These are difficult times. Joseph Sr. planted one last time in hope of success. If this resulted in failure, he decided he's going to take the family and they're going to leave and go to New York, where most of his brothers had gone, and he had heard that wheat was being raised there in abundance. Well, the result of that 3rd year was monumental. Total failure. In fact, the year of 1816 was known as the year without a summer, or 1800 and frozen to death. Snow fell in June and July. Now, this phenomenon was due to a change in the weather pattern caused by the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. The volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora has the distinction of being the largest eruption ever recorded. It also has the little-known distinction of playing a small role, you might say, in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The exact eruption is given either as April 5th or 7th, 1815, depending on the sources that you read. If April 7th is used and time zones are considered, believe it or not, the volcanic eruption took place on April 6th, 1815, North American time. When Tambora erupted, roughly 4,000 feet of the mountain summit disappeared, and it caused a huge caldera to form over 15 miles across. Estimated on the amount of debris ejected vary, but the most common figure is 36 cubic miles of earth disappeared. The shoreline of the town of Tambora dropped 18 feet, and the explosion was noted well over 1,000 miles away. The greatest damage occurred within a 300-mile radius, where there was total darkness for 3 days, much like the darkness recorded in the 8th chapter of 3rd Nephi in the Book of Mormon. The hot air rising from the mountain caused hurricane winds to converge from all directions, drawing up entire buildings and all form of life. This, with other factors, then caused the Smith family to leave New England forever. Now, moving on through our visitors center, we come across some beautiful portraits. This beautiful portrait is a portrait of Joseph and Emma. Joseph loved Emma greatly. This picture by Liz Lemon Swindle depicts Joseph and Emma welcoming the Murdock twins into their life. It seems that Emma had recently lost twins within hours of their birth. And John Murdock, whose wife had died in childbirth, had delivered twins. So unable to care for them, he had asked Joseph and Emma if they would be interested in adopting the twins. They did. Joseph and Emma had 11 children, but unfortunately only 5 lived to adulthood. This was not uncommon for children born in the 1840s. There was a 50% chance of losing either mother or child. The average age or lifespan of an individual living during this time is 37 and a half years. It's rather remarkable that Joseph Smith's grandparents, they defied all these odds. Aziel Smith lived to be 86 years old. His wife, Mary Duty Smith, lived to be 93. Solomon Mack, 88. And Lydia Gates Mack, 86. Wonderful that Joseph had these parents living during his lifetime. This portrait, entitled My Beloved Emma, is also of Liz Lemon Swindle. It shows what a private moment might have been like with Joseph and Emma. Attached to this picture is one of my favorite quotes in our visitors center. It seems that Joseph and Emma had been separated for some time as Joseph was hiding out on one of the islands in the Mississippi or the 70s Hall, trying to avoid being captured by some of the constables that were always pursuing him. Emma was brought to see him, and he said, "With what unspeakable delight and what transports of joy swelled my bosom when I took by the hand my beloved Emma, she that was my wife, even the wife of my youth, and the choice of my heart." Our next room that we have in our visitor center is the meditation room. The predominant feature in this room is the life-size bronze statue by D.J. Bowden. This sculpture also utilized the death mask of Joseph to create the likeness of the prophet. It's been said in the Bible that by their fruits you shall know them. This is a timeline from the birth to death of the prophet Joseph Smith. It lists many of the most important events and accomplishments during his lifetime, culminating in his and his brother Hiram's martyrdom in Carthage jail in 1844. Below are a sampling of scriptures and teachings of the prophet, as well as some biographies and histories written by scholars about his life. In the back corner of this room are portraits of 4 prophets of the church: Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow. They are depicted because they all knew the prophet personally and left their testimonies of his divine calling. There is also a portrait of our current prophet, Russell M. Nelson. The final exhibit is a portrait and a sculpture of the Savior with Joseph's testimony of Christ as recorded in Doctrine and Covenants section 76, verses 22 through 24. And now, after the many testimonies which have been given of him, this is the testimony last of all which we give of him, that he lives. For we saw him even on the right hand of God, and we heard the voice bearing record that he is the only begotten of the Father, that by him and through him and of him the worlds were created, and the inhabitants thereof were begotten sons and daughters of God. Well, we'll conclude our tour of the Joseph Smith Memorial Visitor Center by quoting to you from E.T. Sullivan. I really like this quote. He used it quite often touring groups through. When God wants a great work done in the world or a great wrong righted, he goes about it in a very unusual way. He doesn't stir up his earthquakes or send forth his thunderbolts. Instead, he has a helpless baby born, perhaps in a simple home and of some obscure mother. And then God puts the idea into the mother's heart, and she puts it into the baby's mind. Then God waits. The greatest forces in the world are babies. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our brief tour of our visitor center there at the birthplace of Joseph Smith. Before we move Joseph to New York and really get into the nuts and bolts of his life and following rather closely our Doctrine and Covenants, I'm going to do a podcast next that's going to highlight this monument. I want to share with you the miracles surrounding the erection of the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial. So we'll do that next time. And then from that point on, we will begin a detailed look into the life of Joseph as a young lad in New York, and follow the rest of his life up and through his death. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour.